Hello and welcome back to episode 5 of the Combat Club. My name is Mike Owens and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Jon Anik. Jason, always a pleasure to catch up. How are things with you, my man?
Pleasure is mine, and what I like about this, right? I do podcast appearances or even my own podcast with Belal Muhammad. And I always come on right before we go on. I refuse to say anything in the pre-show, right? So I like it. We got on a little bit. Hi, how are you? How was Manchester? And let's go. I love it. Keep the bullets loaded. Good to see you, brother.
Well, I was going to ask, which was the bigger high, UFC 304 and seeing Belal Muhammad become welterweight world champion, or the UFC 306 at the Sphere last weekend?
Great question. Absolutely great question. So what I'll say is that for those, I don't know how many of your podcast fans know about sort of American sports, but in Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm from, it's all about championships. And there have been a lot of them to celebrate over the years. And what I kept saying was those championships meant a lot to me, whether it's football fans, British, European football, American football. Championships can mean a lot to fans. And when Belal won the title, it trumped all of those for me. It meant more to me than all those Boston championships combined. 2 weeks later, I found myself in my house blasting his song, replaying sort of Buffer saying and new so conversation. And I said, and Daniel Cormier said it was the best night of my life. And I sort of uttered that same phrase. It really felt like the Sphere was the best night of my life. So I'm glad you brought me back. Little recency bias there. The Sphere was magical, bro.
Can we talk about Belal? Because where did your relationship start with him? Out of interest.
So Belal Muhammad, UFC welterweight champion of the world, just in case those of you have forgotten, and based on your accent, I can tell maybe some Leon Edwards fans out there. But Belal and I started doing a podcast together called Remember the Show, September of 2020. My brother, Jon Anik, wanted to pair me up with a UFC fighter that maybe, he thought would show up every week, didn't necessarily have the highest profile, but did think that he had a very high ceiling. And I think Belal was maybe ranked 53 overall at the time.
Wow.
I said recently that I didn't know who he was when Jon came at me to try and do the show. So Belal didn't like that. But yeah, that was September 2020. He was certainly not ranked in the top 15 at that time. Now I believe he's the number 5th ranked pound for pound fighter in the promotion. So I'm just so happy for him. The dominant win. But yeah, it's been about 4 years and a lot of ups and downs, a lot of different times at which we weren't sure if he was going to get the opportunity he so richly deserved. Sure.
We were talking about Belal. I didn't know that the origin story of your podcast was that Jon set you up for that. That's fantastic, and to see not only the growth of your pod, Remember the Show, but also Belal's growth in his career. What was the fight prior, Belal's fight prior to you starting that show?
Oh, that's a great question. I want to say Lyman Good
That's what I
was
would have presumed.
either,
Yes.
yeah, I feel like that might have been right before or the first one during. But when I even think back to the eye poke with Leon Edwards in 2021 and Belal taking that opportunity in short notice and where he is now relative to then. But ultimately he didn't get finished that night, right? And if the head kick finishes him that night, it could be a different story. So, but it's just fascinating to think back as time goes quickly. You're a young man, but I'm 46 years old. So you can be sure that 2020, September of 2020 to now, not that long in sort of my time on this planet.
100%. I asked this question to Jon when we caught up ahead of 304, and I framed it very, very delicately because I didn't want to indicate that he was in any way unprofessional at his job. But the question I asked him was, how do you keep your bias aside from commentating such a big fight when you do obviously have a personal relationship with Belal? And Jon obviously talked about the relationship that he's had with Leon over the years, but slightly different on your end. Would you say it was a biased night for you when you were stood in the Co-op Arena in Manchester on July
Oh,
27th?
Oh, no question about it. And I'm careful with my biases, but I'm not my brother, And so, frankly, it's very interesting from my brother's standpoint. For me, it's Belal Muhammad all the way, but trying not to disrespect. I used to have very long hair. I shaved my head and I did some Instagram sort of story, maybe a few months before Belal and Leon's championship fight. And my brother said to me quickly, like, you got to grow your hair out. You can't be doing posts and new, and people thinking you're me. You can't make that happen. But the position of my brother, right? His call of Leon Edwards' knockout of Kamaru Usman was maybe the call he's most remembered for, right? So one of his favorite professional moments is when he saw Leon a couple months later and Leon grabbed him and said, yeah, not the cloth I'm cut from or whatever it was. And that that moment for Jon was a very special moment. So for him, sort of pull on both sides. But once the walks are happening, it's very easy for him to sort of switch into that gear. And if you watch the fight back, there was certainly no bias. Is there some emotion? Most certainly. But Dominic Cruz is one of Jon's best friends in the world. And when he next competes and when he's competed in the past, you can be sure for my brother, it's a little delicate balance.
We'll be back to the video in just a second, but first, I got to remind you, the NFL season is in full swing, and Inside Fighting has partnered up with DraftKings, an official partner of the NFL, to bring you an amazing offer. And right now, if you go download the DraftKings Sportsbook app, new customers who bet $5 will receive $200 in bonus bets just by using promo code Inside Fighting.
Out of interest, if Belal is number one on your top 5 pound for pound, most let's say most engaged fighters in terms of who you follow and who you would back to the end of the earth, who else makes that top 5 list? To Calvin and Rob from a Bostonian perspective, because they're my guys.
Shout out the New England cartel, no doubt about it. And unless one of those guys is facing a guy like Belal Muhammad, it's interesting when Cater and Aljamain Sterling faced. I know Aljo pretty well, and he's a New Yorker, and I'm a Bostonian, so that was tough for me. But it's interesting, I've gotten to know a lot of these guys, right? Like Jamal Hill, I've gotten to know a great deal, on a personal level. So you can be sure I was rooting for him hard. I'll never forget. I met him in person after his sort of title, after he had won the championship. I'll never forget that hug from that big athlete. You know what I mean? Unbelievable. Dan Ige a guy who I know well, sort of through Eric Nixick. But the list goes on. The closer I sort of connect to these guys, and you know this all too well, the closer you connect to a guy on a personal level, the more you're sort of invested. And Renato Moicano is a guy I've gotten to know down here living in South Florida. You can be sure that will be pulling at my heartstrings come Saturday night. But I will say, and I don't know when this is going to air, but Ludovic Klein, who is a huge favorite on the card coming up this weekend. I don't know to what extent we're going to talk about it, but if you're asking me sort of my favorite fighter, sort of off the beaten path, it's Ludovic Klein. I've been on that guy for a long time. I think he could be a future champion. So I got to throw that name out whenever I can. Hopefully Ludovic hears it somewhere, crosses his wake somehow.
No, 100%. I always remember when I started doing what I do about 4 or 5 months in, having interviewed both Eric Anders and Darren, the dentist Stewart. They were matched up together, and that sinking feeling of I had to pick somebody who I had out of 2 guys who I had a personal relationship with, and kind of weighing up how I tried to keep that unbiased. It's not the nicest feeling in the world for fans who are watching this who maybe don't understand what we have to go through sometimes.
No doubt.
Out of interest, let's just bring it back to the Sphere before we touch on Paris. As somebody who was in the arena, as somebody who got to experience that, what was that experience like?
Well, I'm glad I have your cell phone number now so I can text you some of the images. I said earlier, best night of my life with respect to my wife. It was an unbelievable night. And what I will say, the experiences were very unique depending on where you were sitting. And my brother Jon spent some time in the Sphere on Thursday and Friday leading up to the event. But I saw it for the first time along with his broadcast partners, Joe Rogan and Daniel Cormier. So we come in sort of a couple hours early for rehearsal. And you can be sure Joe Rogan's not getting to the arena a couple hours early for any of these fight cards. So this was a very unique experience. And it brought us sort of some time to kind of hang out a little bit. So for those of you watching at home or who were there, the pay-per-view open at 10 o'clock Eastern time took place from the 400 level at the very top of the building. So when we went in early in the day, we went up to the 400, saw the rehearsal from up there, and the views from up there, well, maybe you can't see the octagon, but you don't need to. The view of the fights on the screen is better than any view you've ever seen in your life. I can't say enough about the views from the top of the building. It was indescribable. Like literally, I've never seen anything like it. Being down close to the octagon, that brought its own spectacle. I mean, I took a picture of Diego Lopez with his hands in the air, and it almost looks like he's in a coliseum. It looks like a shot from 100 years ago. It blows my mind. And my takeaway is, right, Dana White can do all things, right? Some comments about him getting into the boxing situation. Mike Tyson made some comments today. So I guess for me, right, it's like you back, they say one and done. Find a way to do this. And even going back isn't enough for me. They got to go annually. It's got to be a different theme. I cannot say enough about that night. It was just magical.
What did you make of the main event between Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili? And also, what have you made of the fallout in terms of some of Sean O'Malley's comments regarding 1, 3, and 5 potentially being his?
Good question. Jon always says that seeing a fighter become a champion for the first time is the greatest thing that he experiences. So seeing Merab Dvalishvili, not unlike Belal Muhammad, win 10, 11 straight fights and finally realized it. So certainly happy for Merab. Do I think Sean was a little bit flat? Yes. Some of what O'Malley did in round 5, I certainly thought maybe could have happened earlier with some urgency. Daniel Cormier, I watched the fight back, and at the beginning, he was talking about seeing more from O'Malley, sort of more activity. And I think had that happened, maybe things might have shaped up differently. I'm thrilled for Merab. In terms of breaking down the rounds going back, I just don't care if I'm giving you an honest answer, right? Merab won the fight. I don't think too many people are disputing that. I'm not so sure Sugar Sean would really dispute that. So ultimately, you sort of spin it forward. I hope Sean gets healthy. A lot of exciting fights. But what I like about Merab and Belal is they're going to fight and they're going to keep these things spinning forward. Where Sugar Sean says, oh, I'm going to take 7, 8, 9, 10 months off, maybe a year. That was going to happen anyway, wasn't it?
That's a very good point. I caught up with Mario Batista. I think it was last week or the week before last, and I was asking him about this because over the last 12 months, we've seen a kind of shift in champions where when you look at Merab, you look at Belal, and you look at, to an extent, Dricus du Plessis, and even I would throw Raquel Pennington in the mix for this question. Cardio seems to be their key weapon, and weaponizing cardio seems to be something that we're seeing a shift from. Maybe at a lack of, let's say, a lack of technical ability in some areas. Cardio seems to be a key weapon that some of these guys are utilizing to win championships.
No doubt about it. And you look at Merab, well, now every fight is 5 rounds, and same for Belal. So that weapon can be even more maximized in that setting. But I can't tell you how many fighters have told me their biggest fear is gassing in the octagon. That's the only fear. They're not afraid of having their face look like Irene Aldana. They just don't want to gas in the octagon. And so when you put yourself in a position not to have that happen and have more in the tank than your opponent, I think that could be weapon number 1. That and sort of the mental game, right? Like I can't tell you how often Belal Muhammad and I have talked about different fights that he's watched or broken down where game plan is just wrong and the fighter loses the mental game in there, certainly not the physical game. So for me, I love the point about cardio, and I think it's going to continue to be a big part of the game, especially for some of these young fighters coming up. You talk Raul Rosas Jr., right? Let's see him in a 5-round setting. Let's see, I know he's a kid, but you want some ranked guys, right? Some of that cardio, I think Boy becoming a man can help with that cardio, believe it or not, too.
Who would you like to see Merab face next for his first title defense? Because there is certainly a question over whether Umar Nurmagomedov's stellar win against Corey Sandhagen trumps what Davison Figueiredo's done in his short time at bantamweight.
Both could be deserving in their own right. There are certainly title opportunities that manifest themselves. I'd say more out of thin air, whether it's Steve Erceg or even Jamal Hill grabbing that opportunity at the time. So for me, it's Umar. Period. I just think it's the right time. I'm not too concerned with resume or ranking, right? You could argue that even at the welterweight, Shavkat Rakhmonov, what's he beat Wonderboy? What else is really there on the bone, right? I know he has a win over Jeff Neal. Certainly Figueiredo always moves the needle for me, but if you're asking me the question, it's Umar 100.
Actually, that was a point I wanted to mention. Do you attend every UFC pay-per-view or every pay-per-view that Jon calls?
I got some notes here on 307 and 308, and unfortunately, I don't attend as many as I'd like. Salt Lake City's one somehow I just don't get to. Some of the things in my personal life, my wife and kids prevent it. But I go to as many as I can, but I'm not going to be at 307. I'm not going to be at 308. But you can be sure most of the ones in the US, I'm there. Manchester was my first. Well, I went to Vancouver. Manchester was my first international. I'd love to go to Abu Dhabi. I just don't have the luxury to sort of go away 100. Brother does, but I go to as many as I can, and they keep my seat warm with me next to Joe's security.
You mentioned notes there for UFC 307 and 308. Is there a role that you play on fight week in terms of assisting might be the wrong word, but in terms of helping Jon in terms of his preparation for the broadcast?
When I'm with him, yes. When I'm not with him, not as much. I printed out these fight cards just to see what you might be getting after and just sort of wet my beak with it a little bit. Because as you know, the UFC schedule just creeps quickly. But when I'm with Jon, absolutely. I believe in the Sphere card was 20 fighters. I believe I wrote out 7 of those 20 fighter cards on a plane. But you couldn't even tell the difference in our handwriting. You can be sure if I gave you 2 cards. And we have it. It's interesting. But when I started traveling with Jon a couple of years ago, he started having me write these fighter cards, and I handed him one, and we probably haven't looked at each other's handwriting in many years. And you can be sure just things flow in the same way. But yeah, I help him. But when he's on his own in Abu Dhabi, I'm not, other than moral support. Nope.
So say to that point, do you feel like yourself and Jon would pick up on the same points in terms of, let's say you were both preparing to ask Alex Pereira questions in a fighter meeting, and you were helping Jon through that process. If I both give you a plain piece of paper and ask you to give me it back in 10 minutes, how similar or different do you think the points that you would want to cover would be?
It's a great question, right? Jon and Daniel Cormier were doing some skit recently on some show where it was like a newlywed game where they asked questions about each other and they nailed it all, right? And you can be sure Jon and I would perform similarly in something like that. But I think our life experience has been so different that we do have different perspectives on things. So normally, it's a very interesting question. Normally, my answer would be like, absolutely, we share a brain. Even today, we had a conference call and we're both reacting the same way, making the same sound effect. But in terms of asking questions, his path has been so vast as a journalist and covering this sport that I'm trying to catch up. I try and bring sort of a different perspective. He had Mike Valley and Ignacio Bahamondes on his podcast yesterday, and certainly I'm connected to those guys in a way he isn't through Belal Muhammad. So trying to provide a little bit of a different perspective. I asked him to ask them if they've ever seen Belal wear matching socks, because I have not.
I'll remember that next time I speak to Bilal. That's a very good question, and something that he will certainly like. We've talked a lot about some fights that have taken place. Let's talk a little bit to the future. What is the one fight that is currently booked that you're most excited for?
Well, I already said Ludovic Klein, and if you don't know, talk to me Sunday or whatever time the fight's there for you. I guess Sunday morning for you, possibly. But Ludovic Klein, check him out. But no, I'm really interested in the co-main event this weekend, Brendan Allen, Nasruddin Imavov. My brother has said for a long time, and I don't like to necessarily always say my brother, Jon Anik, but he's certainly connected to the sport. And when Israel Adesanya reigned for a long time, there were a lot of us that thought Brendan Allen might be that sort of unicorn challenge for him, that one challenge that might represent something different, that Brendan Allen's going to try and get it downstairs on the floor. And if he does, he's certainly a finisher down there. So I'm really interested. Brendan's a young guy, and I think he's a future champion. I know him very well. But I think it's a fascinating test that he gets Imavov sort of in this realm in Paris. I think he's like plus 175 to Imavov minus 210. I absolutely think he's live. And I know this isn't a betting show, but I would certainly be looking at some props for Brendan Allen by submission. I love Imavov too, right? And I really look at this as a title eliminator. But for Brendan Allen, there were times at which I thought he might get a short notice opportunity, perhaps. And there's a very interesting sort of group at the top at middleweight. Robert Whittaker never is far from the top of my mind. So this middleweight fight is fascinating to me this weekend. And after a week off, I'm chomping at the bit.
Dare I say there are similarities to Brendan Allen's run than there is to Belal Muhammad's, in the sense of the split decision win, to Chris Curtis back in April, to going into enemy territory to fight a Frenchman in Paris is no easy task. But Brendan, and it's being on a 7-fight winning streak, but Brendan is that guy that nobody is really talking about when you look at some of the other guys at 185 in terms of what he's done currently.
Totally agree. And I think a year ago, maybe they were talking more about him, but a lot of things change and ebb and flow. And I've had conversations with Brendan about just making sure you're ready for that short notice opportunity. I think there were times where he didn't necessarily want to go to Paris and have that be his next opportunity, but I think it's big for him, and I'm happy he's getting it. He's choked a lot of people out in the apex, it feels like. So guys that have won a lot of fights and sort of put bodies of work on paper, I love nothing more than seeing them get opportunities. And I think Brendan is going to surprise some people this weekend, but his opponent is probably a stylistic matchup that may be as dangerous for him as any.
And obviously the main event between Renato Moicano and Benoit Saint-Denis. I actually did some tape study last night and watched Moicano versus Turner and BSD versus Thiago Moises back. Such an interesting style matchup when you look at these two guys and what they can bring to the table.
Just unbelievable. And getting Benoit Saint-Denis after a loss to Dustin Poirier may not be the best time in Paris, right? So not good for you for taking this in that spot. And he can't afford to lose, as he says. So I spent some time with Moicano. We were doing a little thing for UFC, and they were filming him behind the scenes, whether it's for Embedded or whatever it may be. And he and I were standing around sort of after everything had stopped shooting. And I said to him, you're in a fight camp like Benoit Saint-Denis. I was like, aren't you like thinking about this guy all the time? He's like nonstop, brother. You know what I mean? It doesn't stop, right? So you can be sure he's been thinking about this guy, being ready for this guy for a long time. Benoit Saint-Denis, I'd be lying to you if I didn't think that he was a future champion, and I believe greatly in a big loss early on being important along the way. So I think the loss for Dustin Poirier could be the best thing that's happened to him. But I believe in my boy Renato. I love listening to him pronounce Benoit Saint-Denis when he says a B. S-D. I can't get enough of it. I'm rooting so hard for my boy Renato. But I really think I can't wait for the top two fights on this card this weekend.
What's also very interesting, and I don't mean to demean either Benoit's personality or Renato's fighting style when I say this, but they've both kind of become stars in very different ways. BSD has very much become a star based upon the time he's done in the octagon, and having spoke to him previously, he's very stoic. He doesn't give a lot away. He's kind of quite a quiet or certainly humble individual. Renato has kind of taken this star turn, and when you look at the post-fight interview after the Drew's over win, and obviously the I cannot afford to lose after UFC 300. And I actually spoke to him last Saturday and we were talking about this, and he was like, I have no interest in being a star, but I don't know how much I believe him. I know that he gets the game. I know that he knows what he needs to do in terms of using his becoming a star, becoming a personality, becoming Money Moicano, or getting the opportunity that he desires in this lightweight division.
I believe him. I really do believe him. You can be a star without necessarily desiring to be a star. I think he's so authentic. I think he's so true to himself. I think he's so genuinely interested in economics and bright and interested in learning the English language. You can be sure he's studying that sort of, he has finance on the television when I'm at his house, and that's the one thing I do wonder is because he is very bright. And, Jaylen Brown, Boston Celtics championship, NBA finals MVP this year, right? There were some concerns with him coming into the NBA because he's such a cerebral guy and has a lot of other interests. So the one thing I'll say about Renato, I think he has a lot going on outside the octagon right now, genuinely, whether it's Bitcoin conferences or whatever it may be. So I hope those things aren't necessarily distracting, but I don't believe he has any concerns about being a star. You can be sure he wants money, and being a star and money sort of can coincide. But I will say, I do think he can afford to lose in terms of his star power and in terms of his brand. I think he's already sort of cracked through the ceiling there, and I think he's going to continue to explode regardless of what happens Saturday night. But I wouldn't doubt him in the octagon. You can be sure.
100%. Last topic I want to cover before we finish, and thank you for your time. UFC 307 in Salt Lake City next Saturday. It's actually my birthday, the card, so I'm hoping for a birthday surprise and some of the guys that I have relationships with on that card. But your expectations for Salt Lake City?
So I know Kayla Harrison and Juliana Pena well, and I dream of them being able, I think the buildup for that fight and what that fight could do for women's MMA potentially, I think would be electric. Juliana Pena, Kayla Harrison. They're both on the card. I know they're not fighting against each other. I remember watching Juliana Pena on Tough with my wife, I want to say in 2013. And I was like, yeah, she's really attractive. I like her. I like watching her fight. I'm rooting for her. It's been a fascinating career for her. And she's been part of Belal Muhammad's camp. She traveled to Manchester to support Belal in his recent championship fight. So the fact that she's getting another championship opportunity here, and it's against Raquel Pennington, not Amanda Nunes, right? Or not someone of that caliber, with respect to Raquel Pennington, is fascinating for me. I haven't looked at the betting line, but I'm very interested to sort of see if Juliana is ready and can get through this test. No disrespect to the champion, because I think if Kayla can get through her test, I think this can provide a little juice for women's MMA where I feel like it needs a little juice right now. But I can't wait for the card. You could be sure. Stephen Thompson, Joaquin Buckley is one of those matchups for me that sticks out on that one as well.
I asked Kayla about this last time I spoke to her, but are you surprised that she never got the title fight? Because I asked her this question as well. It does feel like her days at 135 are numbered, in the sense of she can only cut that weight so many times before maybe one day she will struggle too much.
Are you talking about Kayla not getting the title fight?
Kayla, excuse me. Are you surprised that they went with Juliana over Kayla Harrison, given their relative positions?
The short answer is no. I don't. And I guess as a casual fan to some extent, I'm more interested in Juliana Pena, Raquel Pennington than I would be Kayla Harrison, Raquel Pennington. But I also think that sometimes given when some crossover, sometimes they're going to, fight for the belt right away. I don't know exactly, but I believe Pantoja's next opponent, maybe someone that's coming in from outside the promotion. So, but for me, I feel it doesn't surprise me at all. I feel like they have correct paths for some of these guys, whether it's Bo Nickel, Ian Gary. I think they're very calculated in what they do. So it doesn't surprise me. I'm not suggesting Kayla Harrison isn't ready. And your point's very well taken about the weight class. But I certainly think if she can get through Ketlin Vieira, she will be next.
And talking about the main event, how real of a threat do you think Khalil Rountree is to Alex Pereira in the main event for the UFC light heavyweight title?
It's MMA. I met Khalil recently, and I think most certainly has a puncher's chance. I think that a lot of us that are fans of Jamal Hill would have liked to see him just go insane and see what can happen sort of right out of the gate. And I think Khalil may do that. But Poatan is so gifted with his footwork, and he's so calculated. And I also, when we see them face to face, I think we're going to see an immeasurable difference in the size of these guys. So ultimately, I'll be rooting for the underdog, I guess. But I think Poatan, I think they're certainly picking his fights carefully. And I think if he is mentally ready to go, he's going to be tough to beat.
Yeah, 100%. Last question from me, Jason, and thank you so much for your time. We started this conversation talking about Belal Muhammad, so I want to end it there talking about Belal. And obviously, whatever, when I say this question, I want you to respond with something that you're comfortable with. But tell us something about Belal Muhammad that maybe people don't know that you would like to share about him, because I do feel like he maybe doesn't get the flowers in terms of not only the fighter, but also the person that he is.
So I don't know if people would consider him a heel, right? But he and I have joked around how it's tough to be a heel when you don't curse, right? This guy, when you're saying fudge instead of, the other word, you really can't be a heel. But what I will say is that I believe that the sort of persona in whether it's in the media or whatever it may be is far different than the human being. And I've yet to meet someone who spent time with Belal that isn't in love with the human being. And he and I had some conversations about Michael Bisping, sort of, and Michael Bisping rooting for Leon Edwards, rooting for a fellow countryman. And I said, Belal, not so fast. Michael Bisping, like countless other people that are in the UFC organization, have met you, have spent time with you, care about you, respect what you've done personally, professionally, and have a lot of love for you. So that's what I'll say is I think that sometimes it can be a delicate handling in certain situations when you're sort of chasing what should be yours, right? And not everyone's Chael Sonnen on the microphone. But I will say, Belal Muhammad is a special human being. I've never paid for a meal. He could have done this camp with Khabib Nurmagomedov. He spent some time with him in Newark, New Jersey, but you can be sure he was going to do champ camp in Chicago with his team, staying loyal to his brothers, the small camp, Mike Valley, Lewis Taylor, and everybody else there. Strap him up. Better human being than fighter. I could go on and on.
I think that's the best place for us to end. Jason, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. I'm really glad that we could put this in the diary, and look forward to doing it with you again in the not too distant future.
Anytime. Look forward to seeing you on the road show, and appreciate all the love you have for my Bostonians up in New England.